Welcome back to the Christadelphian video service series on Bible study under the theme of rightly dividing the word of truth. In our previous sessions, we've looked at Bible colouring, we've looked at Bible translations, chapter divisions, and tonight we're moving on to the margins in our Oxford Bible. So hopefully you have an Oxford Bible as we requested in the previous session, but please, if you can get your hands on one, please do so, because we're going to talk about the margin of the Oxford Bible. So under this theme, a bit of alliteration here, making the most of your marvellous margin is what we're talking about tonight. The plan for today is to explain the different parts of the centre margin of the Oxford edition of the King James Version. So to hopefully give you an understanding, when you look at the margin, you know what you're looking at and what it's actually referring to. The benefits from looking at the margin, the margins are a very, very helpful tool that we have, and something we can thank the translators for giving us, because they were translating the Bible. They began to see lots of echoes. They began to see lots of combined records. They saw quotations from other parts, and so they made notes about them and put them into the margin. And we are really thankful they did that. Very few things in the margin are incorrect. There are some things to be careful about, and we'll talk about those, and then we'll do some practical exercises. So that's what we're planning to do today. Let's talk about the benefits of your margin. Well, it's a readily available tool. Even while you're sitting in a talk or doing the readings at home, you have some information to expand your understanding available in the margin of your Bible. And some Bibles, some of the more modern Bibles, have comments in them. And some of those comments can also be very helpful. But the margin in the King James Oxford Bible is very, very helpful and should always be checked when you're doing your Bible reading. It's right there. You should use it. So basically what the margin is about is cross-references, that is similar verses, similar allusions elsewhere, alternative translations. So when they've been a bit dubious about the word they chose to put in the record, they say, look, we could have put this other word in. So they give you alternate translations. There are suggestions and quotations. So sometimes they say it could possibly be this. So again, they just make references for you to look at. There are quotations called citations. So where a verse is directly quoted somewhere else, both the quoted verse and the source are cross-referenced with a citation. And you get suggested meanings of the Hebrew and Greek. And sometimes they can be quite helpful because they were looking at the root words behind the one that they've translated, and they're still not comfortable they've got it close enough. So they give you suggested meanings. So there's lots of things in your margin which can be very helpful. It's not a commentary, but it supplies additional information, and we need to use it because it's a tool that we have and is vital, therefore, that we understand it. Just a couple of things to be careful about. The marginal notes are not part of the God-given Bible. They're the work of man and not the work of God. So not all the comments are entirely useful. I've only discovered in my lifetime probably half a dozen, I would say, that I would not find it all useful. Some are quite incomplete. Some indicate total confusion, as you'll see in the book of Daniel in chapter 8. But generally they are very helpful. Just be careful, they're not part of the inspired word. When you go to other Bibles, and a lot of the more modern Bibles have commentaries in lieu of margins. And I'm finding with more of the modern translations that the commentaries are very much corrupted by wrong doctrine. And for example, when you read in other translations about the thief on the cross and what Jesus said to him, the commentary is entirely and utterly wrong. So while we're talking about margins in the King James Version, when you come to other Bibles with margins or comments, always be on your guard because some of them can be quite wrong. Always remember that when you come across a text that is difficult, the best way to understand the Bible is let the Bible explain itself. Always look for consistency. If you come across a verse that seems to be completely different to what other verses say, then maybe you have a problem with the translation, maybe you have a problem with the interpretation of that verse. Very few verses stand alone in our Bible. When a verse is quoted somewhere else, you have a guaranteed way of recognizing what the original verse actually meant or was meant to convey. So let the Bible explain itself if you're not sure. So let's then get on to the margins. Well, there are different parts in the center margin. In any margin, and I hope you've got one open before you, you will find letters A, B, C that go down the column to the end of the alphabet, and it starts again with another series of A, B, C if there are more than 26. They refer you from the passage where the little A occurs in the text. They refer to other references in the Bible which might be similar, which might be quotations or common themes or ideas. So generally, the translators said, this sounds like something else I've heard, and they will put an A, B, or C and give you that cross-reference to check out for yourself. Very helpful. Then you get numbers in the margin. So as you go down your margin, you'll come across a 1 and a 2 and a 3. This is where they have given you alternative renditions of a word. It may be based upon a better translation, but a word that didn't quite fit. They've chosen a word that fitted their particular style of translation. But they say, look, maybe this other word could be used. So they give you an alternate translation or rendition of that Hebrew or Greek word. So again, very, very helpful. These notes will enable the passage to be better understood, as they usually give a more exact translation of the original. So you're getting closer and closer to what originally was said, or how that verse was used somewhere else. Sometimes you get meanings of names, and I'll look at some of those a bit later on, but sometimes they give you the meaning of a name, because obviously the meaning of the name is significant to what is being said by the prophet on that occasion. When you have records like Kings and Chronicles and some of the prophets that talk about the same incidents in history, then they give you the cross-references to the sections in the other books which talk about the same events. And particularly in the Gospels, you have 3 Gospels usually talking about a similar incident. Then you find that it'll just give you a whole slab, but it might say, while you're reading Luke chapter 8, you should be in Matthew chapter 6, and you should be in Mark chapter something else. Because this same speech, this same parable is being recorded somewhere else by someone else. So what we call concurrent accounts of the same event are noted, and you can then see those other sections in different records. And that's very, very useful, especially with the Gospels, because between the records there's often subtle differences. And then sometimes in your margin you will get what we call historical footnotes. And the translators give us comments about the history involved, or about related events, which are found in other books of the Bible. So they will tell you this is a development of something else that happened. So they will give you a historical comment. Let's look at some of these just as an example, because you might not have known that these actually existed. Come to Isaiah 39 and verse 7. Now in Isaiah 39 verse 7, we have the prophet Isaiah rebuking Hezekiah for his pride in showing the Babylonians the gold of the temple and the treasuries. And then the judgment was in verse 7, of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and there shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And the marginal note says, fulfilled in Daniel 1, verse 2 and 3. And of course, that's when Daniel and his friends who were of the king's seed, or particularly Daniel was of the king's seed, were taken away to Babylon. So you can see the historical note is made. Look at the 2nd Chronicles and chapter 21. Okay, we're coming to the 2nd Chronicles 21. I'm going to look at verse 3, where there's also historical note. It's talking about Jehoshaphat and Jehoram, his son. Their father gave them great gifts of silver and of gold and of precious things, with the fenced cities in Judah. But the kingdom gave he to Jehoram because he was the firstborn. And in the margin, it's got Jehoram made partner of the kingdom with his father. So there was for a time a shared regency. And again, it's just an explanatory historical note there in the margin in 2nd Chronicles 21, verse 3. Likewise in chapter 20 and verse 36, talks about Jehoshaphat. He joined himself with him to make ships to go to Tarshish, and they made the ships in Ezion Geber. And he joined himself in verse 36. It says he was first unwilling in the margin. So again, they just make their own comment. They're not quoting the Bible. They're just saying, looking at other places, you can see that he really was a bit reluctant to join this enterprise. So again, these are what we call historical footnotes. And, generally they're very, very helpful. So in your margin, we have a lot of odd things. So I'd like you to come to Isaiah 35. And I'm quite amazed when you talk to people who have been around for quite a while that, you refer them to the margin and they really don't understand some of the things in their own margin. And I find this a lot with young people. They read their Bibles, but no one's ever explained to them that the things in their margin are all comprehensible. So reading Isaiah 35, and it starts off, the wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. And when you've got the little C there, which is the rose, it's got in the margin, cant 2:1. And when you ask people what cant means, a lot of people don't know what that means. And simply, it's an abbreviation of a word that we would say like incantations or a song. And it's referring you to the Song of Solomon. So whenever you get cant, it's an abbreviation of the Song of Solomon. If I'd been a translator, I would have put SS or something, or just song or something like that, but they put in cant, which of course was a Latin word for a song. So whenever you come across cant, that's what it means. It means the Song of Solomon. While we're in Isaiah, in chapter 34, look at verse 12 to 14 of chapter 34. And, you get some idea, don't you, about the wild beasts that are there, particularly in verse 13, the habitation of dragons, and a court for owls, the wild beasts of the desert with the beasts of the island, the satyr. Now, both the dragon and the satyr were mythical creatures of the English. The screech owl was an English bird. In verse 15, the great owl. What they're really doing here is displaying their ignorance of the fauna and flora of the land of Israel. They'd never been there. No one had told them what animals were in Israel. Here they are in 1611 trying to translate clear references to birds of various kinds or other creatures, and all they can put in is mythical creatures like dragons and satyrs, which don't really exist, or they can put in English birds. So again, when you go to the margin in these places, you see that they offer some alternatives. And you've got the Hebrew word put in. They're just saying, look, the Hebrew word is Jim, or this one is that, or a night monster. They're just telling you, we have got no idea what this Hebrew word means because they had no knowledge of it. So again, all they can do is to give you the Hebrew word to check out for yourself. And it's just an indication that they are really struggling with not knowing what animals they're talking about. You find the same. We won't go to Leviticus 11, look it up, but you can go there in your own time. And as we've always said, as we go through these recordings, please, if you want to check something out, please stop the recording, go off and check it for yourself. When you go to Leviticus 11 and you have the list of unclean beasts and birds, then you get a lot of very odd English names applied to Middle Eastern animals and birds. And it's just one of the sad facts about the timing of the King James Version. Genesis 35 verse 5 is important because in the Bible, many significant trees existed. You have oak trees at Bethel, at Shechem, and other places where lots of events would happen around these particular trees. And the reason for that was that these trees were solitary trees. They grew alone. They often grew where a well would be dug, and they provided shade over the well for the shepherds during the heat of the day. But because they were solitary, huge trees, they were places you could say they were landmarks. You could say, I'll meet you by the oak of Shechem. There was only one there, and you could go to it and you knew that's where the well would be. So they were significant landmarks. And whereas the oak trees in England, most of them grew in very thick forests. Today, some are very isolated and stand out as magnificent individual trees, but most oak trees were English trees that grew in forests. The Jewish tree is the terebinth tree. And because they'd never been to Israel and seen a terebinth tree, which was a solitary tree, they put in oak trees, which is a bit sad because that's the only sort of wood they knew. But the terebinth tree was quite a different tree, but it was a magnificent solitary tree. And so it became a place where things were buried, where the patriarchs of Israel were buried under the oak of Shechem, for example. Joseph is there. The idols of Jacob's house are there. Under the oak of Bethel, you've got Deborah. So these were significant trees. So when you come to Genesis 35, verse 5, and it talks about the oak tree, it's actually verse 8, as we should have it. So in verse 8, you see there that this is where the Deborah was buried under the oak tree at Bethel. So again, you need to just translate oak into terebinth trees. Sometimes your margin will give you a long explanatory note. Just come to the book of Acts and chapter 13. And we get quite a significant comment made here in Acts chapter 13. It's actually a comment about the relationship. It's talking about Lucius or Cyrene and Manaen. So this Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So in the margin it has, or Herod's foster brother. So again, you have a historical comment being added there to the record. In verse 34 of Acts chapter 13. This is where we have a really long note. It says at the end of that verse, I will give you the sure mercies of David. And when you go to the margin, for the little 3 in the margin, you've got the Greek holy or just things, which word in the Septuagint, both in the place of Isaiah 55 verse 3, many others see that for which is in the Hebrew mercies. So you've got a very significant note in Acts chapter 13 being added there as well. So again, they are giving you extra information about the history or about the translation that they had to make. So again, the margins can be very helpful for you. So other times you'll get this letter in the margin. So the letter might be A, B, C, or D, but we're just putting an X for the sake of the presentation. So when you get just one letter, it's another quote with a similar expression or a similar idea or even a similar reference. When you get compare X, then you have a similar theme or principle being cross-referenced. So not just a similar expression, but now a similar theme or a principle that can be found somewhere else. Let's just do one of these. We go to Exodus chapter 19, verse 9. So in verse 9, and the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord. So you can see that there's a reference in the margin, a little g, people may hear when I speak with thee. And they were to hear the voice of God. So the translators picked up that there was a similar incident in John chapter 12. So we come to John chapter 12, and this is the time when Jesus was making the entry to Jerusalem. And Jesus said in verse 28, Father, glorify thy name. There came then a voice from heaven saying, I have glorified it and will glorify it again. The people therefore that stood by and heard it said that it thundered, or that an angel spake to him. So you see, this is a similar type incident. Back in Exodus, God would be speaking from the mountain and they would be terrified by his voice. Here there was a voice like thunder that spoke from heaven to Christ. So they put a little compare in the margin to suggest to you to go and look at another similar type passage. So it's not just a similar expression, it's a similar theme or principle when you have a compare in front of the letter in your margin. And then you get the cited. Now let's come to Hebrews 12 and verse 20. In Hebrews 12 and verse 20, it says this, But they could not endure that which was commanded, and if so much as a beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned or thrust through with a dart. So again, it's referring to Israel at the mountain, in the Mount Horeb, and the terrible fear they felt at the presence of God on that mountain. But it said that nobody was to come near it, not even the beast was allowed to go near it, and they couldn't even drag the beast away, they had to kill it on the spot. So this sense of awe is trying to be conveyed. And the fact that people felt that they had to be kept away from the mountain in Mount Sinai. So when you go to your margins of verse 20, and it starts off with, and if so much, again, it's a G, and you go to your margin, and you see it says cited generally from Exodus 19, verse 12 and verse 13. So this is a direct quotation, or a very near thing to a direct quotation. When it says generally, it's not precise, but it seems to be very, very similar, that's where it's coming from. And this is where a writer can go back and say, well, I'm telling you that this situation is talked about back in the Bible, and he then quotes just the words. And the translators have given you where this is cited from, or quoted from, as we would say. So it's a direct quotation, or very near to a direct quotation from another place. So let's always be aware that the Bible is directed by the one eternal power of God. We should expect consistency of theme and teaching. We ought not to be surprised that there are so many cross-references, so many common themes, so many expansions of themes in later writings. It's the one mind of God behind those who wrote these things down in the way that God wanted them recorded for the benefit of all future generations. Our translators have done a very good job of trying to find as many connections as they can across the Bible. And I believe they were astounded by the consistency of the teaching of the Bible. And that's why they gave us the margin to just illustrate how much they were impressed by that. So citations go two ways. When you have cited in, that's the source quotation. It's telling you that this verse is quoted somewhere else. When you have cited from, it gives you the source quotation. So you can go to both ends of the story and you can see where it comes from and where it's gone. And particularly when you get to the end one, you can see how it's been quoted. Has it been applied and opened up and expanded? But often it does. So let's look at one of these in Matthew 27, verse 31. This, of course, is around the death and resurrection of Christ. And many, many scriptures were being fulfilled and brought into focus at this time. So Matthew 27 and verse 31. And Jesus said unto them, all ye shall be offended because of me this night, for it is written. So he's actually saying, I'm quoting you the Bible. I will smite the shepherd and the sheep, and the flock shall be scattered abroad. And you go to your margin, and it says, cited from Zechariah 13, verse 7. So again, you are left in no doubt that this is the case, that this is a direct quotation. Go on to verse 38. But he said unto them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death. Tarry here and watch with me. And you know, this is very likely being a psalm being quoted. My soul is sorrowful unto death. And again, we need to see if we can find something that matches that. So, you know, there are citations that we can find in that section, and we need to check out why is this context being quoted. Let's look at Isaiah 42 and verse 1. This one is a very challenging one, because in the Bible, quite often a prophecy will have more than one application. And it certainly applies to the servant that God talks about in Isaiah 42. Starts off in verse 1, behold my servant, and behold mine elect, in whom my soul shall delight. I put my spirit upon him, he shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. Well, you can see that particular quotation, particularly when it talks about he shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles, that's used in other places. The little d in the margins is cited Matthew 12, verse 18 to 20. And it's not the only place it's quoted. There are sections of Isaiah 42 that the Apostle Paul applies to himself. So again, when you see a cited in the margin, always go to the other end of the passage, or go back to the source of the passage and just see how it's quoted, in what context, and whether there are more than one applications being made. So citations or quotations are very, very helpful, because this is the Bible verifying itself and using itself for further expanding the thoughts of God. So here is the homework for this session, and we're going to have a second session on the margin. I want to encourage you to actually use something that a lot of Christadelphians have but rarely use, and that is the maps at the back of their Bible. When you are reading any passage in the Bible and you come across a place name, it will be on one of those maps in the back of your Oxford Bible. And there is a very good index. So if you come across a name like Arbella or Tishbe or Megiddo in your Bible, then you will be able to find it in your Bible somewhere. Now, a name like Arbella, of course, is not in the Bible, but it's mentioned in history to do with Alexander the Great. So I'm just giving you some examples of how you can find places that are in your maps at the back of the Bible. So a good exercise, just practice using the index to find places so that when you read, you'll automatically go to the index and just make sure you know exactly the place you're dealing with. And bear in mind, the maps, of course, are geared to different times in history. So we'd encourage you, the homework for this week, to practice using your King James margin just to work out things that are there. And we'll deal with a second stage in this margin section next study. Thank you.